The plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda is unlawful. The government loses its appeal to the Supreme Court. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Jonathan Gullis, Labour MP Sarah Champion, The Guardian's Kieran Stacey and Noah Hoffman from The Sun. Today,
the legal test which has to be applied in this case is whether there are substantial grounds for believing that asylum seekers sent to Rwanda would be at real risk of refoulement. In the light of the evidence which I have summarised, the Court of Appeal concluded that there were such grounds. We are unanimously of the view that they were entitled to reach that conclusion.
The government loses its appeal to the Supreme Court. Sending asylum seekers to Rwanda is unlawful. I must surely conclude now you never had any intention of keeping your promises. Sacked Home Secretary Suella Braverman hits back in a no-holds-barred letter to Rishi Sunak. Inflation falls to 4.6% in some good news for the Prime Minister as he meets his pledge to halve the rate at which prices are rising. As Israeli ground troops enter the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza, the Commons votes on whether to call for a ceasefire. Will Labour MPs defy Keir Starmer? It's certain to be a fiery Prime Minister's questions on a pivotal day for Rishi Sunak. We will bring you that. Yes, there's been huge anticipation ahead of today's landmark ruling by the Supreme Court. Their conclusion, a huge blow to the government and the Prime Minister's leadership pledge to stop the small boats. The government's flagship policy was to send people claiming asylum to Rwanda to have their claims processed in order to be granted asylum there. It's been deemed unlawful, rejected by the Supreme Court on the grounds of what they call, a French word, refoulement. Those grounds are based on a real risk of genuine refugees being returned to their country of origin by Rwanda and their lives subsequently being placed in danger because their claims had not been given full consideration. In a moment, we're going to speak to the BBC's Home Editor, Mark Easton. We also know that there is going to be a press conference by the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, later on this afternoon. He will, of course, be addressing questions during Prime Minister's questions before that at midday. First of all, let's listen to a longer excerpt of the ruling that was delivered just over an hour ago.
The legal test which has to be applied in this case is whether there are substantial grounds for believing that asylum seekers sent to Rwanda would be at real risk of refoulement. In the light of the evidence which I have summarised, the Court of Appeal concluded that there were such grounds. We are unanimously of the view that they were entitled to reach that conclusion. Indeed, having been taken through the evidence ourselves, we agree with their conclusion. We accept the Home Secretary's submission that the Rwandan government entered into the agreement in good faith and that the capacity of the Rwandan system to produce accurate and fair decisions can and will be built up. Nevertheless, asking ourselves whether there were substantial grounds for believing that a real risk of refoulement existed at the relevant time, we have concluded that there were. The changes needed to eliminate the risk of refoulement may be delivered in the future, but they have not been shown to be in place now. The Home Secretary's appeal is therefore dismissed.
Jonathan Gullis, your reaction?
Well, obviously, it's a very disappointing judgment for the government to receive. I'm personally disappointed as well because I do think that actually the Rwanda scheme was a key part of a wider set of reforms and changes that we made in order to deter people from crossing. simply now the government has to quickly come out with a plan B. As a member, as you know, Joe, of the New Conservatives, I was sat with other colleagues from the ERG just before coming to you here on air. And essentially, we've got some ideas. Number one is that Danny Kruger, Bill Cash and myself did put forward a notwithstanding amendment to the Illegal Migration Act before, obviously, it passed through the House of Commons. The Prime Minister could bring forward a notwithstanding bill to disapply all treaties and conventions that we're signed up to.
All of them, so not just the European Convention on Human Rights that you've talked about. Yes, we heard it,
Lord
absolutely.
Reid referred to, obviously, the UN signatories as well, like the Refugee Convention of 1951. Another idea is that we actually use the powers in the Nationality and Borders Act to literally push back boats as they're crossing the Channel into French territorial waters. I would personally have no issue with us actually taking people back to French shores immediately.
Well, you know, of course, that's been tried by Suella Braverman, in fact, and Priti Patel, and it was dropped.
But ultimately, the government has to now, in my opinion, go into a deep, full review of all our obligations under international treaties and convention, because the sovereignty of our country should not be in question. We should be able to control our own borders, and I find it very sad today for people who are looking for this government to deliver on that important pledge, because Labour have no answers to this question.
Let me get the reaction from Sarah.
I mean, my frustration is it's always someone else's fault, isn't it? And actually, when we look back over successive Tory governments, under Cameron, they cut 1,500 border staff. They've cut police. They've cut armed forces. They've cut money to local authorities that were trying to support people. And rather than dealing with the actual problem and addressing it and coming up with solutions, we have at best a red herring, at worst a dead cat of this Rwanda thing thrown in front of us. They've wasted a parliamentary bill, now an act, when they could have been doing something to, I don't know, deal with the housing crisis, deal with the cost of living crisis.
But
instead, from the very beginning, we've said that this is unlawful, we've said it's unworkable, but now it's still someone else's fault.
Take responsibility.
Well, hang on. I'm going
to really clear what Labour's plan is.
A quota-sharing scheme with the EU, so we take 100,000 more illegal migrants. We surrender our borders.
Let Sarah
speak. You've asked me a question. Do you want me to speak?
Sarah, I'm always happy to hear you speak.
Thank you very much. So first of all, what we will do is we'll deal with the source, which is the traffickers. So as long as there is money available, there's going to be traffickers. So we will put traffickers on a par with terrorists, so to make it really inhospitable. We will make sure that the Home Office actually is able to process genuine asylum cases and get rid of people that have no right here as quickly as possible.
And
through the measures that are already in place.
Hang on, because we need to just focus. We'll come back to all of this, but let's just focus on the ruling and what it means directly for the government, because our Home Editor is outside the Supreme Court. Mark Easton, hello to you. It was an emphatic ruling by the Supreme Court. What does it mean for the government?
Oh, I don't think this could have gone worse for the UK government than what they said, because it wasn't just that they lost on the argument as to whether Rwanda needed to be a bit safer. The evidence that was produced and quoted by the justices was really saying that Rwanda is far from being a safe country for refugees. Even after the UK signed its Memorandum of Understanding, refugees were being sent back to the very countries from which they'd fled. And that is essentially, as you've been discussing, I'm sure, the centrepiece of the argument, whether or not somebody who's a genuine refugee comes to the UK, gets sent to Rwanda, and then ends up being sent back from the country where they fled from. So there was that. I think, in a sense, although the judges were very, very clear to say, look, we're not being political, we're just being judicial, just being legal, actually it was a real criticism of the way in which the whole Rwanda policy had been put together. The descriptions of the extrajudicial killings that Rwanda are involved in, the corruption of judges, the failures of the state in so many ways, the failure to so many refugees. All of this stuff, the justices said, was evidence that was available to the UK government, and yet we have seen throughout, from the Prime Minister through the government, people saying, oh no, Rwanda's entirely safe, it's not going to be a problem. Well, I think that was actually an serious implicit criticism of the government policy. And the other issue, which I know you have been discussing, is that the justices were very clear that this was not, if you like, simply the fact that we are a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights. It is also our obligations under a number of international treaties, not least the UN Refugee Convention.
Right, so you may have heard our guest here, the Conservative MP Jonathan Gullis, who is part of a group of Tory MPs on the right of the party, saying that they've already got proposals to disapply all the treaties that were listed and that we are signatories of, and also be in favour of pushing back boats, a policy that was tried and was dropped, actually, by previous Home Secretaries. What's your reaction to that in terms of disapplying treaties?
Well, I think the Home Office's kind of view before today's announcement was that perhaps we could put together a more formalised treaty with Rwanda or other countries that would take account of the concerns of the Supreme Court. I think that their sort of interpretation of the situation in Rwanda really means that any plan like that is probably out the window. I think we ought to point out that the Illegal Migration Act, which is the centrepiece of their migration policy, it's impossible really to know where that goes now. It's not been operational in main part yet, but without anywhere to send anyone to, that piece of legislation looks dead in the water too. So far as the UK leaving not just the European Convention on Human Rights or disapplying from the UN Convention, I mean, this would be massively controversial. It would be a huge gamble by the Conservative government, because many people in Britain, whatever they might think about small boats, whatever they might think about the court in Strasbourg, they do feel that the values and principles which we fought for after the Second World War, we were the architects of much of this international law, that they absolutely chime with UK values. And I think that would be a very, very controversial step for the government to take. As for pushing the boats back in the channel, well, I think I heard you say, I mean, this has been put forward as a proposal. Actually, when you're faced with the realities of people in a flimsy dinghy in the middle of the channel, pushing them back, the risks that would have for those on board are so significant that I think it's almost impossible to make that policy work.
Mark, number 10 is pointing to the Court of Appeal, and I'm paraphrasing here, so forgive me if it's not entirely word for word accurate, but they are pointing to the fact that the principle of sending asylum seekers to a third country, you have articulated effectively what the judge said about Rwanda not being deemed safe in that regard. But the principle of sending asylum seekers to a third country was something that they would consider lawful.
Yes, and I think that is where we are. I think that the decision of the appeal court and indeed the High Court before that, that the principle of using a third country to deal with asylum claims is something that could be done. Well, I think actually, to be honest, I think all bets are off on whether the government would be able to pursue a similar proposal, perhaps with another country. I've heard lawyers here outside the Supreme Court shortly after the judgment suggesting that really there's no way that people can have their asylum claims dealt with in a third country. It will have to come back to the UK with all the difficulties that they face with that, given the enormous backlog in the system.
Mark Easton, thank you very much for talking to us outside the Supreme Court. Let me just show you this tweet talking of the political temperature rising as we approach PMQs in just over half an hour's time. Harry Cole in The Sun has said Sir Simon Clarke, who was a government Minister, Secretary of State under Liz Truss, the previous Prime Minister, says that Rishi Sunak's, the Prime Minister's response to this ruling is a confidence issue. Do you agree, Jonathan?
Prime Minister, I think, should remain the Prime Minister and the leader of the Conservative Party to the next election. But the Prime Minister did also say he was going to do everything he needed to do to stop the boats. And that means making very tough and uncomfortable decisions. And we heard there, obviously, about disapplying treaties that we've signed. I would remind Mark, who was talking, that, first of all, the Refugee Convention was written in 1951. We are in a very different world to what it was back then, with global movements of individuals far greater than whenever was anticipated when that was written.
Yes.
We also obviously have to make sure that, again, in 2016, the largest ever electoral mandate in the history of this country voted for us to take back control of our laws and our borders. I was proudly part of that campaign. 73% of my constituents in Stoke-on-Trent North demanded it to happen, and we therefore have to deliver on
It's whether there's the
votes.
political will right at the top of government to actually do what you would like to see, and it doesn't look as if there is at the moment. No, what's your reaction, first of all, to the ruling and what you've heard from Jonathan, and Sir Simon Clarke saying that this, or the Rishi Sunak's response, is a confidence issue?
So let's not sugarcoat it. This is a huge embarrassment for the Prime Minister. He's suffered a series of major blows throughout the past year. The Tories are, 20 points on average behind in the polls? I think another poll that came out the other day put them on even further behind than that. There was a small win for the PM this morning when he achieved one of his 5 pledges to halve inflation. That small win lasted all of 5 minutes because the moment the Supreme Court ruling came out, that was the story of the day. That's going to be the story for the rest of the day. And it's embarrassing. So much has been staked on the Rwanda policy succeeding. It was something that a lot of MPs believed would genuinely stop the boats. And I think there is a very genuine cross-party desire to see the boats stop because they are unsafe. And it is something that the public want to see as well. But this is really humiliating, and I think it will embolden the right of the party. Some will go further than Jonathan is. Jonathan's saying that he wants the Prime Minister to stay, and I think the last thing that the Tories need is a civil war. But you will see some even further right to Jonathan who will call for some sort of confidence.
How much trouble is he in, Rishi Sunak?
Well, I think, in a way, Jonathan kind of sums up the mainstream feeling in the Tory party right now, which is you can't have another leadership election now before the general election. And that's what's keeping Rishi Sunak much more confident than he might otherwise be. So we saw his reshuffle this week, where it was a much more centrist reshuffle than we might have expected. And I, for example, thought that if he was going to sack Suella Braverman, he might bring in someone like Kemi Badenoch to keep people like Jonathan happy that they had a Home Secretary who represented their views. But he obviously didn't. He's got James Cleverly, who's much more of a centrist in there. He's obviously brought David Cameron back in. That, to me, speaks of a Prime Minister who kind of is on slightly surer footing than we give him credit for. I think he bets that the Tory party is not going to oust him. And I think Jonathan's words also suggest that.
Yeah. Right, well, if I just show you this, Brendan Clark-Smith, your colleague, Tory MP, we've been here before, enemies of the people. This is referring and overtly saying that the judges are political, when actually the justice here made very clear at the beginning this has nothing to do with politics. They were just looking at whether the Rwanda policy was lawful. Do you want to disassociate yourself with that or agree with Brendan?
Well, I read that he was saying that about the Tory party, so thank you for the clarification.
Well, I'm just assuming, but maybe it is about the Tory party.
Well done, Sarah. I'll give you that one. I've got to give you that. Look, first of all, what Brendan wants to say is on his behalf. I'm not here to talk on behalf of Brendan.
No,
what I would say, Joe, is that Lord Reid and the justices have every right to determine if I'm going to believe in sovereignty of our nation, then I have to believe in checks and balances. The Supreme Court is an important part of that system. So you accept the judgment? I accept the judgment. I certainly dislike it, but I accept it, which is why I came on this show and said to you the government now should proceed with a notwithstanding bill, preferably, if we can get it through in time. But I would like, if we're not longer term, to have a full deep dive review of all conventions and treaties we signed up to, and then go to the public in our manifesto saying that we would, for example, as I've said before, happily leave the European Convention of Human Rights.
Or do what Lee Anderson, the Tory Vice Chair, is suggesting. This has been tweeted by Kevin Schofield. We should just put the planes in the air now and send them to Rwanda and show strength. Would you be in favour of that?
Well, again, the judgment has said that we're not able to do that.
Right.
And as much as I would like that to happen, I would see that would just be we'd be in court. Having fights when actually we could be quickly producing legislation. I mean, Lee is obviously Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. That's something for him and the Prime Minister to resolve.
Is that responsible, then, from the Vice Chair of the Conservative Party?
He's entitled to that opinion. I think it's good to have strong opinions in politics and then we can debate and discuss them. And Lee, and like I say, I agree with most things on Lee, but as I say, I'd rather spend my time now having a notwithstanding bill brought to the floor of the House and then having a deep review into our obligations and treaties. But I'd also like Labour to accept the fact that they're going to surrender our borders to their buddies in Brussels and move them to the Mediterranean so we have mass migration on an even larger scale into our country.
Sarah will obviously disagree with that, and I'll just come to you in a moment. Let me just read you what the Home Secretary, the new Home Secretary, James Cleverly, has said in direct response. We're, of course, going to hear a statement from him in about an hour's time. He said our partnership with Rwanda, while bold and ambitious, is just one part of a vehicle of measures to stop the boats and tackle illegal migration. But clearly there is an appetite for this concept. Across Europe, illegal migration is increasing and governments are following our lead. Italy, Germany, Austria are all exploring models similar to Rwanda. We will carefully review today's judgment to understand implications and next steps. Are you prepared to wait to see what the government is actually going to unveil and how they're going to react?
Well, what I'd like the Home Secretary to make clear, and I think he's coming to the floor of the House later on today, is how long am I expected to wait for? Because my constituents are at breaking point. My area voted 73% to leave. It was the 5th largest contributor to the voluntary asylum dispersal scheme. We've had hotels, albeit one, though, thanks to my campaigning to end Serco's abuse of Stoke-on-Trent, seeing one of the hotels emptied. If I've said it before, Joe, the Conservative Party doesn't get on top of this issue and deliver, we're toast at the next election. I've no doubt about that. And the opinion poll that Noah was referring to shows quite clearly that, you know, Nigel Farage sitting in the jungle might be helpful till Christmas. When he comes back, he can cause an awful lot of problems, particularly in the Red Wall.
All right, well, let's just go into the House of Commons because we have got PMQs coming up in 25 minutes' time. And, of course, the drama will all be inside the chamber. It's not looking very full now, but I bet every seat will be taken by midday. Grateful, of course, that you two are keeping us company here. Sarah, on the principle of sending asylum seekers to a third country, that was accepted by the appeal court. That hasn't been ruled out of hand in this Supreme Court ruling. Do you accept that as a policy, that is a workable policy, that Rwanda's just not the right country?
What I don't accept is that it will make that much difference, because the assumption of sending people away, stopping the boats...
Being a deterrent.
Being a deterrent. How is that a deterrent if you're a Syrian woman fleeing your country with your child, you don't speak English, you're promised absolutely everything with bells and whistles by the people trafficker? How are you going to know that this is the outcome if you take that risk? What I would much rather us do is, rather than spending foreign aid on hotels, which is a ridiculous waste of taxpayers' money, and I am glad that the government is trying to address that, we actually look at the reasons why people are fleeing their homes and then put in measures that they don't have to flee their homes. And we're seeing this all around the world now. And unless we deal with the bigger underlying problems, these sort of show ponies that keep being trotted out as distractions are only going to ever be that. They're not going to actually make the difference. And I thought it was very bold of Rishi Sunak to come out with this stop the boats thing.
Yes, not reduce it, but stop them.
Exactly. And Suella Braverman's thrown him under a bus because of it. And I think what we're seeing now is this unravelling of all of the promises that he didn't get elected on it, but he got into leadership on. And we need to see the government in its dying breaths do something that actually helps this country, rather than looking for this next leadership battle which seems to be playing out.
Sarah talks about trafficking, and of course that is absolutely disgusting, but it's also important to remember that those being trafficked are in a tiny minority compared to those who are being smuggled, which is entirely different. Those are people who are voluntarily choosing to put tens of thousands of pounds in the hands of smugglers to enter our country illegally. And those people, who are predominantly young men, you know, are choosing to come here. And of course, I was down with Border Force in Dover myself. They are telling me that the smugglers are instructing people things like, once you get halfway across the channel, call 999 because the phone signal to the UK is picked up, and say where you are and you'll get rescued.
But the point is that Rishi Sunak's deterrent plan has been chucked out of court. Are you worried that there isn't a plan B from Rishi Sunak on this issue, and therefore you are toast, to use your words, because nothing will happen between now and the election?
Suella said that there isn't a plan, and your plan is to ram the boats, which I don't really think is...
Well, I've said other things than that, but look, I certainly think we should use the powers in existing law. But look, in terms of Plan B, look, I've asked the question multiple times in meetings with the Prime Minister, with the former Home Secretary about Plan B. I've been reassured that things are being worked on. I will go in good faith that Plan B is going to be announced soon. But if it isn't, then the Conservative Party will reap what it's sown. Right,
well, let's have a look at what Suella Braverman said in that excoriating letter that she sent to Rishi Sunak after she was sacked. We didn't have to wait long. If we lose in the Supreme Court, she says, an outcome that I have consistently argued we must be prepared for, you will have wasted a year and an Act of Parliament only to arrive back at square one. Worse than this, your magical thinking, believing that you can will your way through this without upsetting polite opinion, has meant you have failed to prepare any sort of credible Plan B. It doesn't look like there's a Plan B, according to Suella Braverman. I can only surmise that this is because you have no appetite for doing what is necessary and therefore no real intention of fulfilling your pledge to the British people. Is there anything in that you don't agree with?
Well, Joe, I was a former teacher. I like to believe that you should always look at two sides of the argument. Suella has presented her side of the argument. We will hear in the short term, and I expect short term to mean by the end of the week, in my opinion, personally, what Plan B is. And if the Prime Minister comes out with a comprehensive plan, then happy days. All I can say is from my personal experience of dealing with Number 10, Will Tanner, for example, who was obviously former Director of Onward, Deputy Chief of Staff, when we were looking at the amendments to the Legal Migration Act, he was very diligent, as was Robert Jenrick, in going across the detail. And so I do have, based on previous working experience, belief there will be a Plan B.
Right,
Whether I like the Plan B is another question altogether.
Right, you have a different Plan B, and that is what we talked about at the beginning, disapplying from various treaties. As I say, there doesn't seem to be an appetite for that at the top of the leadership. What do you make of Suella Braverman's letter? I mean, I've never seen anything like it in a resignation letter. Over all the years I've been covering the Westminster beat. What did you make of it? I
mean, it was certainly very colourful. The sort of energy that I describe this letter as is, I dumped you, you didn't dump me. And I suppose one big question critics of Suella would have, understandably so, is if this was how you were feeling for quite some time, because you clearly didn't feel like this overnight, why are you doing it now? Why did you wait till you were pushed? Why didn't you fall on your sword? But with that being said, this letter has, you know, struck a chord with a lot of MPs on the Tory right.
A lot? What sort of number are we talking about
now?
So
we're not talking critical mass.
No.
I believe that the majority, a significant majority, maybe not a vast majority, are on the PM side. But this sort of, I would say, circa 40 MPs on the right of the party, you know, they're representing constituents with very strong views. They have very strong views that they're passionate about, and they have a lot of power to cause a lot of chaos.
Right. I mean, I'll go into the letter in a little more detail in a moment. But first of all, what's intriguing about the letter is the document that Suella Braverman refers to, the document that she and the Prime Minister signed as a condition for her support for Rishi Sunak in the leadership.
I think in a way she's actually shot herself in the foot here, partially because the language is so extreme. I think she could well alienate potential supporters. But also, she talks in this letter, her central thesis is that you, Prime Minister, are not upholding your democratic mandate. In fact, you don't have much of a democratic mandate because you didn't win a leadership contest properly. I won it for you. But also, you're not sticking to the manifestos we had when we got into government. Then she talks of a secret document that she signed, didn't tell anybody else about, the voters were never allowed to see, let alone actually vote on. I mean, how is that a democratic process? I don't understand what her argument can possibly be there.
What does that say?
Well, I have no idea of any document or agreement. I backed Nadeem Zahawi, I then backed Liz Truss, and then I backed Boris Johnson to come back.
What does it say about Rishi Sunak's leadership, that he signed, according to Suella Braverman, and the indications
Joe, there's always two sides to a story, so I'll allow the Prime Minister the space, if he wants to actually address the issue himself. But I'm not surprised that deals are done all the time when it comes to colleagues. There's no way that any political party is free from having had a conversation. Literally, Blair Brown, the promise of Tony Blair one day stepping aside for Gordon Brown. But I do, but now Suella's put this in the open. It's now got to. Let's be honest, it'll eventually come out what this agreement was, and now people have to make up their mind.
We might not have to wait too much longer for it, but
I mean, I was just quickly, deals are done, but it's usually for position. It's Blair and Brown, I'll get to take over after you. We thought the deal with Suella was you'll be Home Secretary. Apparently, according to Suella, it's not. It's much, much bigger than that. It's the central themes and policies that this government should enact were decided, she says, by her in a secret room.
Well, let's have a look. I think we can draw out some of those parts of the letter to point you in the direction of what she actually says. I agreed to support you because of the firm assurances you gave me on key policy priorities. This was a document that we agreed to in October 2022. You have manifestly and repeatedly failed to deliver on every single one of these key policies, as Kieran's been saying. Either your distinctive style of government means you're incapable of doing so, or, as I must surely conclude now, you never had any intention of keeping your promises. What does that say about Rishi Sunak? Is she right?
I'll give you another example. So here we go. When we put forward the amendments, which was asking for us to disapply these Rule 39 interim injunctions that we get from the European Court of Human Rights that prevented us from putting people on planes when we attempted the first trip to Rwanda, I put that forward as an amendment. The Prime Minister said his office would support us in working with it. We spent 3 weeks going through the detail. We got to an agreement and they put that into their legislation. So to be fair, my work dealings with the Prime Minister and his team are that when there is common ground that can be found, we work together constructively. Let's
just go over just broadly. I don't want to go into the substance necessarily of the policies, but what Suella Braverman was talking about was reducing overall legal migration as set out in the 2019 manifesto, including specific notwithstanding clauses into new legislation to stop the boats, excluding the operation of the European Convention on Human Rights, etc., delivering the Northern Ireland Protocol and retained EU law bills, and then unequivocal statutory guidance to schools. Has Rishi Sunak failed on those policy areas?
Well, actually, the last time I spoke to the Prime Minister about the guidance regarding trans issues in schools, I think that guidance is going to be coming forward soon.
All right, and what about the other three?
He's working on that with the notwithstanding. Yes, as I said earlier, we didn't get to agreement. We found a middle ground, at least on the Rule 39 injunctions.
Sure, and he hasn't reduced overall legal migration. He has the Windsor framework in terms of Northern Ireland.
I rebelled on Windsor framework. I was one of 22, so I was, you know, the Windsor framework is not something for me to go into. The Prime Minister and I met face to face and I explained my reasons why. But with legal migration, Suella is absolutely bang on the money that people are as angry about legal migration numbers as they are about small boats. And the New Conservatives put out a 12-point plan on how that can be tackled.
Right. I mean, yesterday, Thangam Debonair, your front bench colleague in the Labour Party, couldn't commit to reducing the level of legal migration. And I presume that is a statement of fact, then, from...
I mean, it is what it is at the moment. I think we've got a very clear plan about what we're doing. But going back to Suella's letter, I mean, for me, he's either lied to Suella or he's gone into hock over his policies to get leadership position. Either way is not the person that I want, but it does make sense because Rishi Sunak does seem sort of genuinely indifferent to the plight of the British people, and the policies that are coming forward, it very much seems that he is being swayed by whoever is going to keep him in power. Well, and for me, this letter is justifying that.
Well, which do you think it is? No, do you think he lied to Suella Braverman or wasn't completely clear with the truth of what was promising, just to become leader of the party and Prime Minister?
No, I don't think he will have lied, but politics is so tumultuous. The situation on the ground changes on a day-to-day basis, and politicians need to be able to be flexible. So I have no doubt that he could have entered into this agreement in good faith, perhaps with a genuine desire to achieve what was listed, those policies. But, you know, as circumstances change, you need to be able to be flexible, and Suella Braverman, as a senior politician, should be able to understand that.
Right, is that why Rishi Sunak couldn't get rid of Suella Braverman before?
Well, he was obviously worried what the reaction would be, and now we're starting to see it. The question will be, can he withstand it? And as I said before, I suspect he can. I think he's taken the gamble that he was looking worse by not sacking her when these acts of insubordination were becoming so obvious than he would... you know, if she exploded as she's doing now. One thing I'd like to see, actually, is her say some of this in person. I think she needs to speak in the Commons and actually say this herself. And I think that would have a lot more power than just the letter would.
Right, well, I mean, she may well do that, of course. One of the other parts of the letter, Jonathan, is where she criticises Rishi Sunak's failure to rise to the challenge posed by the increasingly vicious anti-Semitism and extremism displayed on our streets since Hamas's terrorist atrocities on the 7th of October. I think we can see that there on the... Ah, here it is. I have been urging you, I've become hoarse urging you to consider legislation to ban the hate marches and help stem the rising tide of racism, intimidation and terrorist glorification threatening community cohesion. I regret to say that your response has been uncertain, weak and lacking in the qualities of leadership that this country needs. Do you agree with Suella Braverman on that?
I've been disgusted by what I've seen, particularly on the streets of London with the anti-Semitism. I've been appalled by the weak leadership of Mark Rowley in not banning the marches over the armistice weekend, which would have been an opportunity to dial down the temperature for everyone to pause and reflect after having week upon week of having to look at these appalling marches. But I will also say this, because I'm proud to represent a Pakistani community and Kashmiri community in Stoke-on-Trent, North, Kidsgrove and Talk, and the rise in Islamophobia is also a huge concern, which is why I didn't want any marches or any protests of any kind, from the idiots on the far right to the anti-Semites that we saw on the streets, because ultimately we should have had a weekend of solemn reflection for those who lost their lives to give us the freedom.
But is she right that the failure of Rishi Sunak to bring in legislation that would have helped ban those marches, that his response has been uncertain, weak and lacking in the qualities of leadership this country needs?
I don't see how legislation would have changed anything. Actually, Mark Rowley, again, I will say this, I'm saying it clear on air, Joe, was weak in his leadership to request to ban the marches.
But the government could have done something if they really wanted to stop those marches. They could have brought in
the
legislation.
operational independence of the police. We can also give our opinion as politicians. I've given my opinion here on air, what I think about Mark Rowley on this particular issue, and I'm ashamed that he allowed those scenes to unfold on the streets of London when I was in my community remembering our fallen heroes.
So Suella Braverman's out of order then, claiming it's the Prime Minister's fault?
I just disagree with Suella on that particular point. I think that this is a Mark Rowley issue.
No?
So I think under the Public Order Act, it's up to the police to make that initial approach and advise the Prime Minister whether or not a march should be banned. That approach was not made, so Rishi Sunak couldn't ban it. And he made very clear that, you know, a lot of the soldiers who tragically fell in the First World War were falling for our democratic freedoms and our rights to protest. But I just can't emphasise strongly enough, as a Jewish person, how just devastating, disgusting and scary. Not everyone, to be clear, but a sizable number of people on those marches were, and made my community feel. And I do think, to his credit, that the Prime Minister, as well as Sir Keir Starmer, have been very clear in condemning that. I
mean, the police have said that it didn't reach the bar. It didn't reach the bar that they worried about there being serious violence, and arguably the majority of people on that march were peaceful, calling for a ceasefire in Israel and Gaza. But what do you make of what Suella Braverman blaming the Prime Minister for the fact that she couldn't enact legislation that would have, in effect, forced the police to ban these marches?
Yeah, well, it's another example, I think, of her not necessarily making as strong a point as she thinks she is, because she was Home Secretary.
Exactly.
You know, she was absolutely the heart of the government, and she was able to influence policing very strongly as that. She seems a lot of the time to want to almost be a commentator on the outside, and that is, I think, how she's now positioning herself, trying to distance herself from decisions she was actually a part of as Home Secretary.
Let's just have a look inside the chamber, which will no doubt be filling up now, as it's only 10 minutes until Prime Minister's questions. And, of course, we'll be expecting Rishi Sunak to answer questions about the fact that the government and he have lost this landmark ruling in the Supreme Court. They have ruled the Rwanda policy unlawful. But that's not all that is going on this afternoon. We also have the statement from the Home Secretary. I read a little bit of his initial statement following that ruling. James Cleverly will be standing up in the House of Commons and outlining the government's response. Jonathan Gullis, our guest here, wants to see something pretty radical. So we'll see if you agree with whatever the plan B is. But there is also going to be discussion around the King's Speech and amendments on a ceasefire, or not, as the case may be. The SNP motion is going to be pressurising the government and opposition to call for a ceasefire. Labour has its own amendment, which has called for a longer humanitarian pause, but stopped short of actually wanting a ceasefire. We can see it here. This House wishes to see an end to the violence in Israel and Palestine, acknowledging the daily humanitarian pauses to allow in aid and the movement of civilians. Believes that they must be longer to deliver humanitarian assistance on a scale that begins to meet the desperate needs of the people of Gaza, which is a necessary step to enduring cessation of fighting as soon as possible and a credible diplomatic and political process to deliver the lasting peace of a two-state solution. Well, it says pretty well everything, Sarah, except calling for an immediate ceasefire on both sides. How are you going to vote?
I'm going to vote with Labour's amendment, and then I'm going to see if the government rows in behind us and whips their MPs to support it, because what we need to be seeing is a way out of what is a horrific humanitarian situation. We need to see a very clear path to get to a safe, secure two-state solution, and I'm not seeing that in the language of the government. And let's be clear, this is an amendment to the government, because I'm not seeing them taking the clear action that I am other world leaders.
Right. Well, let's have a look at your colleague, Dawn Butler, Labour MP, ahead of tomorrow's potential vote. It's today's. Here is my statement. Many constituents and others have been asking me about today's amendment in the House of Commons regarding a ceasefire. I would like to confirm I will be voting in favour of a ceasefire on both sides. I've been calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire on both sides for many weeks and the release of all hostages. Is she wrong?
No, she's right. We do need a ceasefire.
Right.
I do want want international leaders.
So why aren't you backing
to say,
it?
well, I didn't say I wasn't backing it. What I said was I'm backing Labour's amendment.
Yeah, but there is an amendment. But there is an amendment that's going to call for a ceasefire, which is what you believe. Sarah.
And then, depending on what happens to that, I'm going to make a decision on the SNP one. And at the moment, I want a ceasefire. The SNP one talks about a ceasefire, but it doesn't talk about the day after. It doesn't talk about the process. So, to be honest, I am that MP that is sitting on a fence, because what I want to do is put maximum pressure on the government to get them to move, because that's what our job is. And I haven't decided which way the cards are going to land.
Right, there will.
No, I'm not being Sarah, because actually,
realist.
no, you are being. Look, I respect the honesty, but let's be honest. You're trying to put it back onto the government.
It is the government.
It's not the government here. You're trying to walk the tightrope of keeping Sir Keir Starmer happy, whilst actually trying to stand up for what you and many of your colleagues privately believe. The things I'm told in the corridor. So I respect the fact you've been honest, but today is about: are you going to back the SNP motion? I can tell you now, I'll be voting with the government. I'll be voting down the Labour amendment, because ultimately the Labour amendment is just politicking against the SNP's amendment. I'll be voting against the SNP amendment because we keep talking about ceasefire. No one's talking about the 200+ hostages in these.
Everybody's
and what happens about those hostages?
No
amendment.
Everybody
does
is.
the amendment mention the word hostages in Labour's amendment? Do the word hostages appear?
No, it does. I think it does.
I think we've only taken part of it.
Well,
it probably
hostages, until the hostages are released, there should be no conversation about ceasefire. We talk about what is proportional. Well, what is proportional to 1,400 people massacred in their homes and 200 people taken capture? You know, at the end of the day, Israel has every right to defend itself, and of course we want a two-state solution. I'm absolutely keen for that. Hamas have destroyed
Well, hang on. Well, at
happening.
this point, because you know the images are absolutely horrifying from inside Gaza. At the Al-Shifa hospital particularly, they are the most recent images we've had of Israeli defence forces. They have gone into the grounds. It's a big hospital in Gaza. They've gone into the grounds there, they say, on a targeted military operation. But the language yesterday in the House of Commons from both Andrew Mitchell, who is speaking on behalf of Lord Cameron, as he will be known, the now Foreign Secretary in the Commons, and the response from David Lammy, who is the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has really hardened up in the last week or so. Let's have a listen.
With services and communication in Gaza under unprecedented strain, it is difficult to be absolutely certain about how events are unfolding. But the reports we have had from partners make clear the appalling loss of life, including amongst children and aid workers.
More than 11,000 Palestinians have reportedly been killed, with 2/3 of the dead being women and children. This is shocking and devastating. Every civilian death is an equal tragedy. Does the Minister agree with me that the number of Palestinian civilians and children who have been killed over the past month is intolerable?
If it's intolerable, why aren't you calling for a ceasefire?
I am. I've been calling for a ceasefire
Well,
from
why
the
aren't
very
you backing
start.
the ceasefire amendment?
What I'm optimistic of is that Cameron's going to do the right thing.
Is that an honest position when you've been so clear that you want to see a ceasefire, you agree with Dawn Butler, and you are not backing the amendment that calls for that? Now, whether it makes any difference, of course, on the world stage and what Israel does is a different issue. But in terms of being true to yourself, should you not back the SNP motion?
I am seriously thinking about backing the SNP motion when I see what happens to Labour, and I really, really hope that the Conservatives do the right thing and back our amendment as well, because it is their policy, and we have to find a solution, not just for today or 10 days or 10 months, but for 10 years and 100 years. And that's where I need the government to be right now. And so I'm using the tools available to me to try and make that happen.
No, what did you make of the language being used yesterday by Andrew Mitchell and David Lammy? They're getting as close as they can to calling for a ceasefire without doing so.
Yeah, and I thought that their language was very appropriate. There is not a single person in the world who will look at images, videos of bombing and destruction and not feel anything but utter heartbreak. And when we see calls for ceasefires from Labour MPs, it comes really from a very genuine place, from a humanitarian place, and I respect that. But what those MPs do, what I'd like Sarah to do, what I'd like Dawn Butler to do, is explain what Israel is supposed to do when Hamas is a group of genocidal terrorist maniacs who don't want a ceasefire.
No, they're not.
They don't want a ceasefire.
I agree.
Dawn Butler's tweet says there needs to be a ceasefire on both sides. Hamas has come out and said, ha ha ha, lol, no ceasefire from us. So, sorry, what does she want Israel to do?
You're not wrong. I agree. But we have to start talking.
Yeah.
We have to find a solution.
I agree.
Otherwise, this tit-for-tat is going to be going on indefinitely.
But Israel cannot just sit there and have October the 7th happen over and over again.
I agree.
Which Hamas has come out and said they are more than happy to do.
I agree, but we also can't see breaches of international law.
Yes, I agree with that
We can't see war
too.
crimes. We
Yes.
can't see civilians
But are
being
using
targeted.
hospitals as Hamas have been doing? We found tunnels, we found weapons in these hospitals.
Well, that's
No
what the
hostages
Israeli
are being
Defense
kept.
Forces said, and it's been verified or underlined by the Americans, although the US Secretary of State, Kieran Anthony Blinken, is also getting close to President Macron's position of stopping the violence. How difficult is this for Keir Starmer? Will he sack front benchers who walk through the division lobbies with the SNP on their motion for a ceasefire?
Yes, he will. That's what they've said. They've been pretty clear, the Labour whips. They are prepared to sack any frontbencher who votes for the SNP motion. I personally, we've been told that they've got about 15 people on resignation watch, but I suspect it'll be closer to 5.
I would agree.
Between 3 and 5, I would expect to see rebel and face the sack. The interesting thing with this, of course, is it's not quite the same as the dynamic in the Tory party, where there is a group, not Jonathan, but there is a group who want to bring the Prime Minister down. I think these rebels in Labour don't actually want to bring Keir Starmer down because they think they're going to win the next election. So they're in a really difficult position where they want to show what they think, but they don't want to bring him down.
Into the chamber.
Minister. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, at the start of this year, I made halving inflation my #1 priority. Today, we have delivered on that commitment. There remains more to do, but this is a strong step forward. This morning, also, the Supreme Court gave a judgment on the Rwanda plan. They confirmed that the principle of removing asylum seekers to a safe third country is lawful. There are further elements that they want additional certainty on, and noted that changes can be delivered in the future to address those issues. The government has been working already on a new treaty with Rwanda, and we will finalise that in light of today's judgment. And furthermore, if necessary, I am prepared to revisit our domestic legal frameworks. Let me assure the House, my commitment to stopping the boats is unwavering. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will be making an oral statement shortly to the House. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Prime Minister took office, he promised to lead a government marked by integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level. What is it about the judgment of David Cameron and his relationships with Lex Greenhill, or his lobbying for Chinese state interests, that make the Prime Minister consider him to be a suitable candidate to be the Foreign Secretary?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that the former Prime Minister has rejoined government as Foreign Secretary. He brings unrivalled experience and relationships across the world and will do a fantastic job championing British interests everywhere he goes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tackling illegal immigration is a crucial issue for my constituents, many of whom will be extremely disappointed at this morning's judgment from the Supreme Court. Is the Prime Minister able to update the House on what this decision means for the government's plan to tackle illegal immigration?
Prime Minister. Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question? I know he has championed this issue and it matters to his constituents. As I said, the judgment confirms that the principle of removing asylum seekers to a safe third country is lawful. The government has already been working in advance on a new treaty with Rwanda, which we will finalise in light of today's judgment, so to address the challenges that were raised. But let me say this again. If it becomes clear that our domestic legal frameworks or international conventions are still frustrating plans at that point, I am prepared to change our laws and revisit those international relationships. The British people expect us to do whatever it takes to stop the boats, and that is precisely what this government will deliver.
I come the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister obviously thinks so little of his own MPs that he's had to peel David Cameron away from his 7-year exile in a shepherd's hut and make him Foreign Secretary. But a few months ago, the Intelligence and Security Committee said that the now Foreign Secretary's role in a Chinese investment fund may have been, and this is their words, engineered by the Chinese state. I hardly need to remind the Prime Minister of the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party or the intimidation against members of this House. So when will he instruct the Foreign Secretary to give full public disclosure of his work for Chinese interests?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, I'm delighted that the former Prime Minister has rejoined government as Foreign Secretary. As an individual with unrivalled experience, he will help Britain navigate an uncertain world in challenging times. Of course, like every other government minister, he will go through the normal process with the independent adviser. But the government's position on China is clear. China represents an epoch-defining challenge. That's why we have taken strong and robust steps to protect ourselves against the risk that it poses. But we'll take no lessons, Mr. Speaker, from the Labour Party on protecting our national security. They've taken almost £700,000 from an alleged Chinese agent.
Mr. Speaker,
Sorry? Yes, I think now you're on the front bench. We need to just calm down. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, for someone who spent the last few weeks complaining about recycling bins, it's ironic that his latest reset involves recycling the architects of 13 years of Tory failure. But this is the Prime Minister who also reanimated the career of the member for Fareham in order to resuscitate his own just days after she was sacked for a national security breach. Is he ashamed that he was so desperate to become Tory leader, so scared to face a vote, that he put someone so totally unfit for office in charge of Britain's national security?
Mr. Speaker, he mentions 13 years. We remember what happened at the beginning of that 13 years. It was this party that restored this country's financial security after the Labour Party left no money behind, Mr. Speaker. And it is a bit rich to take lectures on security from a man who wanted to make the former member for Islington North Prime Minister of our country.
The member for Islington North isn't even a Labour MP anymore. A change party and strong leadership. Mr. Speaker.
Luke, with a lot of business today, very important business with some important votes, and I want to get through this speedily. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, for 13 years our security has been undermined by this Tory government. And now the most ridiculous, pathetic spectacle of all. His Rwanda scheme, cooked up with his National Security Threat Home Secretary, has blown up. He was told over and over again that this would happen, that it wouldn't work, and it was just the latest Tory gimmick. But he bet everything on it, and now he's totally exposed. The central pillar of his government has crumbled beneath him. Does he want to apologise to the country for wasting £140 million of taxpayer cash and wasting his entire time in office?
Mr. Speaker, obviously the person officer didn't hear what I said about our approach to Rwanda, and not least when it comes to stopping the boats. Rwanda is one part of our plan which has already delivered a reduction in the number of small boats this year by a third, Mr. Speaker. But he talks about apologising. He talks about the former member not being a Labour MP now. Yes, he wasn't a Labour MP when he declined 15 different times to say that Hamas was a terrorist organisation this week, which is shameful. But he was a Labour MP. Indeed, the honourable gentleman served with him. He told the country he would make a great Prime Minister. At that point, he described Hamas as friends. Does he want to apologise for that now?
Are we serious? No. Because I'm going to tell... Oh, I wouldn't challenge. Because I've got to say, our constituents are watching this. They're very, very concerned about the affairs of today. They're very concerned about the votes later. A lot of members wish to speak. Those who don't want that to happen, please, go outside, go and have a conversation there. You want to bawl and shout, do it elsewhere. But it won't be happening in here today. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm so glad he agrees this is a changed Labour Party. while he was wasting his time on this gimmick, the asylum backlog has swollen to 175,000 people. Taxpayers are paying £8 million a day on hotel bills, and 615 people arrived by small boat last Sunday alone. Plan A has failed. And after this session, whether he likes it or not, he'll have to go back to his office, back to the drawing board, and start from scratch. Can he assure the British public that he will drop what his former Home Secretary calls his magical thinking and start treating small boat crossings with the seriousness that they deserve?
Mr. Speaker, he talks about a changed Labour Party. Perhaps we'll see that this evening. He can't even make his party do the right thing when it comes to standing by Israel in the vote later today. He talks about taking small boats crossing seriously. He's opposed every single measure that we have taken, Mr. Speaker. Again, let me update him on what we've done this year. The number of illegal Albania arrivals down by 90%. 20,000 people returned this year. The number of crossings down by a third. He mentioned hotels, closing 50 of them. Money being saved for taxpayers. All, by the way, opposed by the party opposite. What is the honourable gentleman's plan? Yes, there we have it. A cosy deal with the EU, which would see the UK accept 100,000 illegal migrants. He doesn't want to stop the boats. He wants to welcome more of them.
Mr. Speaker, it's very straightforward. He promised that he would stop the boats this year. This year. Today is the 15th of November. He's wasted all of his time on a gimmick, and now he's absolutely nowhere. Will he level with the British public and finally admit he's failed to deliver on his promise?
Mr. Speaker, this government has done more to tackle illegal migration than any in the past. And again, let's just review, Mr. Speaker. He's been on the wrong side of this issue his entire career. This is a man who described all immigration law as racist. He said it was a mistake to control immigration, and he has never once in this place voted for stricter asylum rules. It's clear, Mr. Speaker, while he might want to listen to the open border activists, I'm siding with the British people.
I would have thought if he was confident about his promise, he would have given an answer saying he stands by it and will deliver by the end of the year. But the absence of that answer is absolutely amazing in the circumstances. He's had 3 reshuffles, a forgotten conference speech, an empty King speech. He even found time to fanboy Elon Musk. But not one of them has made the slightest difference to the lives of working people. If we had £1 for every time we had a reset, the cost of living crisis would be over long ago. Now, he likes to think of himself as the man from Silicon Valley, the tech-savvy Californian, the country's first AIPM. And yet his big idea is to keep turning his government on and off and hope at the wall and hope that we'll see signs of life. Is he starting to feel that, as somebody once said, he was the future once?
I slightly missed the end of that, but I've got to say, I was glad to hear finally that the honourable gentleman did bring up the cost of living, because on that he is right. That is the #1 challenge facing countries up and down the family. And today, again, he mentioned it, but what he failed to recognise, and he talked about delivering on promises, today was a day that we delivered on the most important pledge I make to halve inflation, Mr. Speaker. Delivering on a commitment, easing the burden for families up and down the country. What we would see from the party opposite is everything would jeopardise that progress, borrowing £28 billion a year, undermining our energy security, giving in to inflation-busting pay rises to his union backers. That's not a sensible plan, Mr. Speaker. It would push up mortgage rates, push up inflation, harm working families. All the while, we're going to continue delivering for the country.
And now for something completely different, question 4.
We are. Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure my honourable friend will be delighted that the West Midlands now tops regional rankings for foreign direct investment. The government is also significantly investing in the region, including hundreds of millions of pounds for Levelling Up Fund and Towns Fund investments, and introducing a new pilot scheme to help businesses in the region become more energy efficient.
Sir Michael.
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend for that encouraging answer? And on behalf of my constituents in Lichfield, may I thank him for having the guts to actually stop HS2. But can I ask that the area within my constituency in the north, where construction is still going on, that this happens swiftly, and that those areas which are not going to have HS2, compensation is also made swiftly to those people who are expecting it.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question, but also for his consistent campaigning on this issue, and I recall his last question at Prime Minister's Questions on this very topic. I'd like to reassure him that we are committed to fair treatment for people affected by the changes, whilst also protecting taxpayers appropriately. Wherever property has been acquired for HS2, property owners have been fully compensated, and any outstanding cases will be settled. We are developing a programme to sell the surplus land on HS2 Phase 2 and ensure that it delivers value for money, does not disrupt local property markets, and I'll ensure that the Rail Minister talks and meets with him swiftly on behalf of his constituents.
SNP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the then Prime Minister and now Foreign Secretary David Cameron said that people in Gaza are living under constant attacks and pressure in an open-air prison. Does the current Prime Minister not agree that if there is not an immediate ceasefire, then all of us in this chamber will be watching on as that open-air prison is turned into a graveyard?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no one can deny the suffering that the people in Gaza are undergoing at the moment. I spoke about this on Monday, and I spoke about it consistently with Mahmoud Abbas, the President of the Palestinian Authority, which is why we're doing everything we can to get aid into the region, and we have repeatedly and consistently called for humanitarian pauses to get aid in and to get hostages and those that need to get out, foreign nationals, as quickly as possible, and will continue, as the Foreign Secretary will do, to make sure that that happens.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, how much worse does it need to get? 4,609 children are already dead in Gaza. Babies in the neonatal intensive care unit are dying because they don't have access to oxygen. For members across the House, this is a question of values and it is a question of conscience. So does the Prime Minister not agree that should there be a vote on an immediate ceasefire, that members across the House should be afforded a free vote?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, our position as a government is clear on this. It's right that Israel is able to defend itself, and that principle is one which we support. It has suffered an appalling terrorist attack. Hamas is a terrorist organisation, and it is not just Israel's right but duty to protect its citizens. At the same time, we have consistently at the United Nations and bilaterally with all our partners called for humanitarian pauses to ensure that more aid can get in, hostages and nationals can get out. That's the right thing to do. We will continue to do everything we can to alleviate the suffering that the Palestinian people are undergoing, and I'm confident that our efforts are already making a big difference on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kirklees Council have closed Dewsbury Sports Centre, delivered just 14% of educational healthcare plans within a 20-week target, are unable to deliver a 5-year land supply, just 3 of its many failings, and now they want to introduce extortionate car parking charges, punishing hard-working families and destroying the high street in our towns and villages. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that Labour-run Kirklees Council is no longer fit for purpose?
Mr. Speaker, I share my honourable friend's disappointment with the Labour-run council in Kirklees. Just this week, we saw, I believe, a Labour councillor suspended for anti-Semitism. As he said, they've also closed the Dewsbury Sports Centre and are proposing to increase car parking charges, punishing local businesses and shoppers in the run-up to Christmas. The council is clearly no longer fit for purpose, and local residents deserve better.
Speaker, last week, members from across the House heard testimony from a young Israeli man who lost both of his peace campaigning parents in the October the 7th attack. This morning we heard from Palestinians who have lost generations of families in the south of Gaza because of the military attacks there. This is a question of humanity and morality.
Hear, hear.
The Prime Minister has an opportunity to lead the calls for peace or endorse death, violence and destruction. Which will he choose?
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, I think that's an extremely naive and simplistic way to look at the problem. What he failed to mention in his question was the fact that a proscribed terrorist organisation perpetrated an awful attack on over 1,000 individuals, and Israel has every right to defend itself in those circumstances, and their country would expect nothing less for them to provide security for their citizens. Now, of course, alongside that, they must abide by international law, and we will do everything we can, as I have said, to make sure that aid flows in and provides alleviation to the suffering that the people in Gaza are seeing.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proposals for a new rail station at Edginswell have been looked forward to for a decade, but a final funding gap exists. Will some of the funds released by the decision to scrap further phases of HS2 be used to resolve this?
Prime Minister. I can assure my honourable friend that our decision on HS2 means every region of the country will now receive more transport investment than it would have done before, including the South West. I'm pleased that funding is happening to protect the vital rail link between Exeter and Plymouth. There'll be a £2.8 billion road resurfacing fund, and his constituents in the South West will continue to benefit from the £2 bus fare until the end of next year. I know that we have previously provided almost £8 million to progress the station that he mentions, and I'll reassure him that the Rail Minister will have heard his representations and continue to update him on the progress that they're making.
Dixman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. David Cameron was the well-paid public face of Lex Greensill. Greensill's companies are facing criminal investigations in Switzerland, Germany and here in the UK. David Cameron messaged ministers and officials 62 times over Greensill's COVID loan guarantees. The Treasury Select Committee called this a significant lack of judgment. What does his appointment say about the Prime Minister's own judgment?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman knows, the government commissioned Nigel Boardman to review all those issues and strengthen the system following those recommendations. But I'm very confident, Mr. Speaker, that this nation will be well represented by the former Prime Minister abroad. He's a Prime Minister with unrivalled experience of foreign affairs, will help Britain navigate an uncertain world in challenging times. And in contrast, the party opposite would offer to the country a shadow Foreign Secretary who backed his predecessor to be leader, was paid to appear on Russian television, and even voted against Trident. Does that sound like a man who should represent Britain?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The inflation numbers this morning were very welcome, but the tax burden continues to bite. So will the Prime Minister agree in principle with me that the concept of higher rate tax was never meant to drag in police sergeants, Band-Aid nurses, teachers with additional responsibilities and others, and that a priority for his Treasury ministers should be to return fairness to the tax thresholds?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree with the honourable gentleman, and I'm pleased that the vast majority of people will continue not to pay the higher rate. I share his ambition to cut taxes for working people. Right now, inflation is falling, and we're sticking to our plan, which is delivering a halving of it this year, because that is the most effective tax cut that we could have delivered for the British people this year, rather than making it worse, as the party opposite would, borrowing money in the way that would be irresponsible and just drive up inflation and interest rates. But I want to reassure him that I absolutely share his ambition to cut taxes for working people, and as we stabilise the economy, that's something that both the Chancellor and I are keen to deliver.
JB.
Mr. Speaker, my son loves football, and I understand the Prime Minister is a big Southampton supporter. So after his latest cabinet reshuffle, I wonder if he can tell me, since 2010, have we seen more Southampton managers being sacked, or have we seen more housing ministers come and go? The answer might help to explain why the government is failing so miserably in new home ownership.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased. I'm pleased that in the last figures that we saw, we had actually a record number of first-time buyers, Mr. Speaker, and we're delivering 1 million homes over this Parliament, as we said, whilst the party opposite blocked our plans to unlock 100,000 homes at the same time. And when it comes to Southampton, I'm also pleased that we're on, I think, almost a 7 or 8 game unbeaten run.
St Desmond Swing.
If a two-state solution is to have a chance, Hamas must be defeated, but also there will have to first be a more enlightened policy of administration in the occupied West Bank, mustn't there?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question. The UK's long-standing position on the Middle East peace process is very clear. We support a negotiated settlement leading to a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank. I spoke about this on Monday. Both Israelis and Palestinians have a right to live in peace and security. The longer-term governance of Gaza and security needs to be looked at in the round. It's something that I've discussed repeatedly with President Abbas. We agree with the United States that Gaza should ultimately be under the control of the Palestinian Authority, and we will continue to support President Abbas and his people to get to that outcome.
Mr. Speaker, a new generation of drugs, or can be Simkevi and Kaftrio, is absolutely transforming the lives of patients with cystic fibrosis. So people who would have been waiting for double lung transplants now living happy, healthy lives. But NICE is now saying we can't afford them. So will the Prime Minister and his new Health Secretary get round the table with NICE and with the drugs company to make sure that children being born with cystic fibrosis today get those life-saving drugs in the same way that children currently living with CF are getting them?
Prime Minister. I thank the Honourable Lady for raising an important issue. I'll of course ask the Health Secretary to look into it. I shall understand that NICE operates independently from government, but if there's a conversation that can be had, I'll ensure that it takes place.
David Davis.
The events of the last 6 weeks, can the Prime Minister tell the House why the government has not proscribed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this government continues to take strong action against Iran, whilst people in the UK and around the world are under threat from the regime. We've sanctioned more than 350 Iranian individuals and entities, including the IRGC in its entirety. The National Security Act of this year implements new measures to protect the British public, including new offences for espionage and foreign interference. And while the government keeps the list of proscribed organisations under review, as members will be aware, it is a long-standing convention that we don't comment on whether a specific organisation is being considered for proscription.
He just said he had unprecedented experience. What would he say was David Cameron's finest foreign policy achievement?
Mr. Speaker, I think there's Mr. Speaker, in fact, the many to pick from. But what I would say is, under his leadership, this country hosted what was widely considered to be one of the most successful G8 summits of recent time.
Vicky Ford.
It was great to welcome the Prime Minister to Chelmsford earlier this year, where he launched his antisocial behaviour strategy, and he will be pleased to know that the local police have consistently been stepping up their activities. Last week they arrested 24 people for many crimes, and last night they took out a major significant county lines gang. So please, will he join me in congratulating all those in our local police? And would he like to come back to Chelmsford and come out and patrol? He's very
Minister. Well, it was great to visit my honourable friend and launch the government's antisocial behaviour plan. Can I thank her for raising awareness about the important work that her local policing team is doing, and I'm pleased that they've been empowered by our strategy. Antisocial behaviour does make life miserable for many. That's why our plan being delivered is so important. It's having a difference across the country, including in her part of the world, and I'm pleased to see that crime under this government, in the year that we most recently have data for, has decreased by 56% since 2010.
Kate Alton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's insulting that in the week that marks 20 years since the abolition of Section 28, the Prime Minister has appointed a minister without portfolio who frequently attacks the LGBTQ+ community with their so-called war on woke seeks a return to those awful days, denying our human rights and attacking our very existence. Does the Prime Minister agree that he has manifestly and repeatedly failed? It's time for him to resign and to call a general election.
Mr. Speaker, actually, this government and previous have a proud record in championing LGBT rights. It was this government that introduced same-sex marriage, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to ensure that everyone in our society can live with tolerance and compassion and have every opportunity available for them. That's what we have delivered, and that's what we'll continue delivering.
Hello, Brian. Mr. Speaker, last year through the Homes for Ukraine scheme, my family and I welcomed a refugee family to our home. And I'm proud that this country has always offered refuge to those who need it. But it's essential that we in this country decide who comes to this country. The Prime Minister has rightly said that he will do whatever it takes to stop the small boats and the evil trade around them. But isn't it apparent that after this morning's ruling, what it will take is a new law to override the Human Rights Act and to cut through the thicket of case law built up by judicial activism so that we can bring back control of our borders and stop the small boats?
Mr. Speaker, it's right that we go through the judgment carefully and properly, and as I said, the government has already been working in advance on a new treaty with Rwanda to address the concerns that have been raised, that were raised previously and that were raised by the Supreme Court, who also acknowledge that changes can be delivered to address those issues. But as I said, and I'll repeat, if it becomes clear that our domestic legal frameworks, or indeed international conventions, are still frustrating plans after that point, I am prepared to change our laws and revisit those international relationships, because we are absolutely committed to stopping the boats.
John Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, thank you for meeting with my constituent Noam. It has been 40 days since Noam's mum, Ada Sagi, was kidnapped by Hamas on October the 7th. We all condemn Hamas's actions and fight for the return of all hostages. Noam wants the language of love to be louder than the language of hate. 11,000 Palestinians have been killed, over 4,000 of them children. International law is important. Does the Prime Minister agree that you can support Israel but also call out breaches of international law?
Mr. Speaker, I've been consistent from the start that whilst Israel has a right to defend itself, it is important that it complies with international law. It's a point I have made on every meeting or phone conversation that I've had with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and it was a privilege to meet her constituents and to hear the pain that they are going through, which I have enormous sympathy for, which is why we're doing absolutely everything we can to bring hostages home. We're engaged intensively in diplomatic activity in the region and working to get also foreign nationals and British nationals. I'm pleased to say well over 200 have now left Gaza, and we will continue to do everything we can to ensure that everyone can safely leave who needs to.
Holly Bancroft.
The Prime Minister knows I stand unapologetically with my steelmakers in Scunthorpe. And he knows that I believe, as many across this House do, that the UK must retain a virgin steelmaking capability for strategic reasons, if nothing else. Will he reassure the House that he is personally following developments at British Steel and doing all he can to retain what is a vital sovereign capability?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for the question? I know she is a fantastic champion for her local steelworking community, and I hope she is reassured by the action that this government has already taken to support steelmaking in our country, reaching a landmark agreement with Tata Steel to safeguard thousands of jobs there, and previously in the pandemic as well, because I agree with her, it is important to our industrial base, and we'll continue to have constructive conversations with all those companies to ensure that we can support them in their transition to a cleaner, greener steelmaking future.
Ian Paisley. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the British Independent Retail Association, on a matter that affects every constituency across this kingdom, 82% of retailers don't even bother reporting physical attacks on their staff when they're attacked. It takes shopkeepers to sell an additional 12 items to make up for an item that has been stolen. Will the Prime Minister support efforts that are being made by that association and many others across this House to ensure that retailers are protected, that theft against them is called out, and that they are supported in every way possible? And today at a meeting in Dining Room C? Will he encourage those members from those shops in their efforts?
Can I firstly pay tribute to the work that my honourable friend does on this issue as the Vice Chair of the All-Party Group on Retail Crime. He's absolutely right about the importance of this issue. Working in my mum's shop and her pharmacy growing up, I understand exactly what he's talking about when small businesses are the victims of crime. What I can tell him is that our expectation and our agreement with police forces is that all shoplifting should be followed up where there is evidence, such as CCTV footage, which is something that we did earlier this year, and also that any violent or abusive behaviour towards shop workers, particularly those who provide a valuable service to the public, is never acceptable, and that is why we introduced a statutory aggravating factor for assaults on workers that provide a service to the public, and I commend him on everything he's doing on this issue.
Questions to William Cash.
Thank you. Will my right honourable friend give the House an assurance that he has made clear to the new Foreign Secretary, who of course we wish well, that and that he has agreed that his policy and conduct of EU-related affairs will be consistent with the government's 2019 election manifesto and the referendum, and is now fully committed to UK parliamentary sovereignty, self-government and democracy, and in accordance with the government's subsequent legislation.
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm delighted to give my honourable friend that assurance, because this is a government that is seizing the opportunities of Brexit, aided by his advice and support, passing the rule bill, ensuring that we can regulate our growth industries in a more competitive way and sign trade deals with the fastest growing regions across the world, including most recently the CPTPP. It's this government that's delivering the benefits of Brexit to every part of our country, and long may that continue.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
Well, that brings us to the end of an expected heated debate in the House of Commons. There's now going to be a statement from the Home Secretary, the newly appointed Home Secretary, James Cleverly, and we will bring you any of his statement that is deemed important to our debate with our guests for this part of the programme. Let me welcome the Maria Caulfield for the Government Health Minister, Bridget Phillipson for Labour, the Shadow Education Secretary, and for the SNP, Brendan O'Hara, Foreign Affairs Spokesman, and the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young. Much of the focus, and there was an awful lot to talk about, but from Keir Starmer, was on the appointment of the former Prime Minister David Cameron, amendments to the King's speech on the situation in Israel and Gaza. But of course, it was that huge blow to the government and to Rishi Sunak's pledge to stop the small boats when the Supreme Court, as we have discussed before Prime Minister's questions, ruled that their Rwanda policy is unlawful. Maria Caulfield, Rishi Sunak told the Commons that he will finalise a new treaty with Rwanda in light of the Supreme Court's judgment. Why? The Supreme Court has deemed Rwanda unsuitable for asylum seekers to be sent there.
Well, I think what the court ruling wasn't about Rwanda as a place of safety. It was what happens to people who are sent to Rwanda and the possibility that they may be returned to their country of origin.
And he said that Rwanda was not suitable for asylum seekers to be sent from here to there to have their claims processed in order to be granted asylum there, because the risk of them being sent back to their original country where they may risk persecution was extremely high.
Yeah, but Rwanda as a country was not the issue. It was the potential for them to be sent back to their country of origin, and that is why the Prime Minister has said he will renegotiate that treaty to put in safeguards that may then reassure the courts.
Well, you say that. Well, let's listen to what the Supreme Court President said about Rwanda. Let's have a listen.
Rwanda has a poor human rights record. In recent times, British police have had to warn Rwandan nationals living in the UK of credible plans by the Rwandan government to kill them. In 2021, the UK government criticised the Rwandan government for extrajudicial killings, deaths in custody, enforced disappearances and torture.
Do you want to revise your statement that Rwanda is a safe country?
Well, I've been to Rwanda and I spent time working in Rwanda, and I can, there have been problems there.
Extrajudicial killings, not problems, Maria.
Yeah, but absolutely, and that's why the Prime Minister has said today that he is going to revise that treaty and try and address some of the concerns that there are. But there are fundamental issues in terms of dealing with the small boats that...
Oh, no, that I understand, but let's just concentrate on whether it's a credible policy and promise by the Prime Minister to revitalise or have a new treaty with Rwanda. Are you saying you're going to be able to transform their human rights record, stop the sort of practices we've just heard from the Supreme Court President before the election?
Well, that's what the Prime Minister is setting out, and he'll be making a press conference this afternoon. It is really important that we deal with the illegal small boats crossings. We are making progress on that. Rwanda is just one part of that solution. And as the Prime Minister said, small boat crossings are down a third. The Albania deal that we did has seen a 90% reduction in Albanians illegally crossing. So Rwanda is one small part of dealing with this.
All right, well, let's put Rwanda to one side. Are you going to be able to find another country? Because it's true that actually the High Court ruled that, in principle, the idea of sending asylum seekers that arrive here to a third country, as long as they are deemed safe, is lawful. So could you pick another country?
Well, other countries are doing that. Italy, for example, are doing a deal with Albania.
Which other country would you be looking at? Because the Prime Minister says that they've had a plan waiting in case the Supreme Court rejected their case. Is there another country?
Well, if you look at what other countries are doing, Italy, for example, are doing a similar deal with Albania. Greece and Austria are also looking at third countries as well. So that is a possibility, and the Prime Minister will set some of the response to the court ruling later on this afternoon. He gave an example of that at PMQs today, but there will be further work done. That you are quite right, Joe, that sending people to a third country is lawful.
But not Rwanda at this point. So you've gifted £140 million to the Rwandan government, which the President of the Supreme Court has concluded has a poor human rights record, and to where you cannot send asylum seekers.
Well, as the Prime Minister has set out, he will look at revising that treaty. That's his aim. So Rwanda is still on the table despite the court ruling.
All right. Well, how's the Conservative Party reacting to this?
Well, there are a lot of ideas knocking around, if you like to put it that way. Now, clearly, many Conservatives for a long time have said that this needs to be sorted. Now, they range from Lee Anderson saying just put the planes in the air anyway.
He's the Vice Chair of the Conservative Party.
Just let them go and ignore the Supreme Court. Now, I would say there's not many who agree with that.
Would you agree with that, just briefly?
No, I think we've got to... revising the treaty is the policy that the Prime Minister wants to follow, and I think that's a sensible one.
So that's one idea that the Prime Minister's clearly looking at, is that the idea of a treaty rather than a memorandum of understanding. But also, he has nodded towards this idea of changing domestic legislation. Now, that's the one I'm hearing the most from people, and they think that that is the route they have to go down. You now introduce emergency legislation in the House of Commons. Now, I did speak to Simon Clarke, Sir Simon Clarke, a former Cabinet Minister, about all of this, and I think we can hear what he had to say to me now.
Let's have a listen.
I think ultimately delivering the policy of stopping the boats is a confidence issue of the British people in this government. It's certainly a confidence issue for my voters in me. By extension, therefore, it is a confidence issue for me in the Prime Minister.
Meaning?
Meaning precisely that ultimately, whilst I have no reason to doubt the good faith of the Prime Minister, and I don't want this to become about a Westminster leadership game, because that it is more serious than that, but a failure to act decisively now would be unsustainable and unacceptable ahead of next year's general election.
Well, he's right, isn't it? It is a confidence issue. It was one of the key pledges by Rishi Sunak. He's not going to stop the boats.
It's one of his 5 priorities, absolutely. He's already delivered on one of those by halving inflation, which we saw the figures today.
He's not going to do this, is he? It's a confidence issue, according to Sir Simon Clarke.
Stopping the boats, and as I said, the Rwanda scheme is just one small part of that. We have seen a reduction by over a third in small boats crossing in the last 12 months. We have seen the Albanian illegal migrant problem reduced by 90%. We're speeding up processing of claims by over 60%. So we are seeing some huge progress.
Are you going to stop the small boats by the time of the next election?
Well, that is the aim, and the Prime Minister said today at PMQs that he is looking at all options to do that.
Right, well, Sir Simon Clarke is also saying that unless you take the action, the requisite action needed in order to stop the boats, then it is a confidence issue. Do you agree?
Well, I think, the Prime Minister is very clear that it's very disappointing in the court ruling today. He will look at the treaty, but he will look at other legal frameworks to be able to stop the boats as soon as we can.
What's your reaction, Bridget, to the ruling, first of all? Remembering that, of course, the Supreme Court President did say that, in principle, the idea of a third country taking asylum seekers from here is lawful.
Well, the ruling is devastating and it confirms what we've known for a very long time. This is a political gimmick. It's all about posturing and it's not going to solve the problem. It was always unworkable. The government have wasted £140 million on this. What we need to see happening, a case is being processed. We need much more of that. We are spending £8 million a day as a country on housing people in unsuitable accommodation, such as hotels. That has to come to an end. We need to process cases. But everything that we've just heard here is about the Conservative Party. This is just about fighting within the Conservative Party, and this happens again and again and again. Could we please just get back to a situation where we're talking about the interests of the country? They should move on from this. It's been found to have failed. They have to find a different way. And I think we just need to get on and have a general election so the British people can have their say about who they want to be running the country, and a party actually focused on the country.
Maria?
Well, I think the British public would be very interested to hear about Labour Party's policy on stopping boats. It's clear from the general election that we last held that dealing with illegal immigration was a big priority for the British people. We're clear about how we want to do that, and we're facing obstacles and opposition to that. But Labour have been very clear that they don't believe in the borders. They want to do a deal with the EU in terms of a quota deal, taking an extra 120,000 people. Processing the claims is important, and we're doing that. But that's just not enough.
Can I just come back? You aren't doing that. And what happens time and again is a complete misrepresentation, as you have just done, around Labour's position. We want to have action to tackle cross-border smuggling, more work with the French, officers based with officers based with Europol, processing cases, more caseworkers to do it, and a bigger focus on humanitarian aid. Well, if you are, it isn't working. And if we want to test what the British people think, there is one way of doing it, and that is to have a general election.
Let me come to Brendan O'Hara. Does the SNP want to stop small boat crossings?
I think it's a false argument.
I'm not making an argument. I'm just asking a question. Do you want to stop the small boats?
I think what we want to see is a fair and legal routes for refugees and migrants to come to this country.
More safe and legal routes.
Oh, absolutely. And this is what this is about. And nobody should be under any illusion here that this was a defeat that was always coming, because every single argument that the Supreme Court gave this today were arguments that were put in the debate, that the human rights record of Rwanda was never going to stand up to legal scrutiny.
But what do you make of the idea that, in principle, it is lawful? It would be lawful if a suitable country was found to process claims and asylum seekers to remain there.
The principle, I think, is morally repugnant. I think the idea of offshoring some of the most vulnerable people in the world who come to this country, who are then shipped off offshore. I think we've seen it. We've seen it in Australia. We've seen it in other countries, and nowhere can you point to it and say that it works, or it is humane,
or
it's just.
It's morally repugnant anyway to offshore and outsource asylum seekers and their applications to another country.
Asylum seekers are different to illegal migrants. And we know that in the small boats issue in particular, the vast majority of them are young men who are crossing. We're not seeing women and children crossing in boats in the same number.
What you've done here, what this government has done, it has shut off every legal route. And so you are forcing people onto these boats. You are forcing people to
the economic
to make
migrants,
these
the vast majority of economic migrants.
The problem is, Maria, that you don't know. You make the assumption that they are economic migrants.
What do you make of the Albanian agreement, though, which has reduced, according to reports, the number of people coming from Albania by 30%?
Well, I think we can get bogged down in individual countries. But what there really
what do you think of that? Does that work in your mind?
There has to be a fair and legal route for migrants to come to this country. And I'll tell you what, Maria, if the government are so utterly obsessed with migration, then devolve immigration
Because
policy.
you would like to have more refugees
people.
and asylum seekers, wouldn't you?
Right, Scotland is desperate for people. My constituency in Argyll and Bute is suffering depopulation.
Well, that's great news.
Devolve it, and we would love to.
What, are you thinking of an independent Scotland and then you would send asylum seekers there?
It's so great to hear that Scotland do want to take some of the refugees or asylum seekers because the figures do not bear that out. There are pockets of the country that are taking more than their fair share.
All right.
I think you'll find that's not
Can I just come back to what Vicky was talking about, which is what parts of the Conservative Party would like to see, and the Prime Minister has actually said that he will revisit the domestic legal framework if necessary and international relationships. Let me just read out a little bit, Maria, of the ruling, because it's not just about, as many people thought, disapplying the European Convention on Human Rights, for example. He said, the President, that actually this idea is laid down in the United Nations Refugee Convention, to which the UK is a party, the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment, the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the ECHR. Would the government be looking at taking the UK out of all of those?
Well, I think that's the Prime Minister is going to set that out later today in his press conference.
OK.
And I think, you know, we've only had the ruling this morning. Sure. And so the government is looking at options. But first and foremost, it's about resetting that treaty with Rwanda and seeing if that will make a difference. But then he has made it very clear that he will look at the legal frameworks, but he will set that...
Of all of those? I mean, I'm just asking. And also, then, the international treaties are reflected in our domestic law, all of those, into the Asylum and Immigration Appeals Act of 1993, the Nationality, Immigration and Asylum Act of 2002 and the Asylum and Immigration Act of 2004. So there is a possibility, when the Prime Minister says, I will do whatever it takes to get a deterrent to stop the small boats, that we could, as a country, not be parts of any of those treaties in our domestic law as well.
I mean, that's the legal work that he will be doing and the team in Number 10 will be doing this afternoon to look at that, because there are complex issues to this. It isn't just as simple as saying to disapply, and that's the work that he'll be doing right now.
I think that's right. I think this is what happens when you go down that populist route, when you don't actually think things through and you end up unpicking individual threads, and you're left at a situation where you're now talking about coming out of the EHCR and all these other international treaties.
Well, Tory MPs have said they're not fit for purpose, some of these treaties. The Refugee Convention of 1951. Let me just read you this from Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister. There is only one way to end the legal blockade on Rwanda, and that is to do exactly what this piece that he's written proposes, and do it now. If you want to know what the government of 2019 to 2022, the one, of course, when he was in charge, would have done, here is your answer. It's the only way. Vicky, what's he talking about?
So what he is talking about in that article, which was written before the summer, is to say that the UK Parliament should deem Rwanda a safe country. So I think we're going back to the sort of same principles, that the UK Parliament passes emergency legislation saying some of these things. But I think the point you're making there, that lots of Conservative MPs, they're pointing to an amendment that was put down previously by Sir Bill Cash, talking about sort of limited derogation, I suppose is the way to say it. Not of pulling out of things like the ECHR or all of these other ones, but you put an amendment down which limits how that applies. Now, the problem is, as you pointed out there, the Refugee Convention runs through numerous laws in this country. And just another little nugget that we've gleaned from allies of Suella Braverman, she talked about, didn't she, in her letter yesterday, a plan B. Now, what her allies are saying today is that her idea was that you do offshore processing of claims in Rwanda, but handled by UK officials. Now, you can see the difference there. A lot of the problem raised in this judgment is that it's the Rwandan asylum system that's the problem. So she's saying that those granted refugee status under that could come to the UK. Now, her allies say that Number 10 ignored that. So is that another option that they could potentially go back to?
Is that an option you'd like to see, Maria?
Well, I think, you know, there's the options are there, and the Prime Minister and his team will be working through those. But it is fundamentally about relooking at that treaty arrangement with Rwanda, because the fundamental problem, both in the ruling today and the previous ruling, was around the potential for where Rwanda sends people back to their country of origin and the risks there. And that is something that can be dealt with by a treaty change.
Right. Briefly, Bridget.
Just give it up, move on. I mean, this is not the answer.
Want to forget about dealing with the small boats completely.
Because this was look. this was only ever going to be 100 people going to Rwanda. It was never going to... No, this was never going to be the answer. There is more than 100,000 cases every year that we're seeing. It's about processing the cases. This is just a ridiculous...
But just to be clear, Bridget, even if Rwanda
things.
were to go ahead at any point, and that looks very unlikely, you were going to reverse it anyway.
Yes, because you would spend the money on cross-border working.
Even if it was a success in terms of
It was never
deterrent.
going to be a success, and this is demonstrated. They know this. They should just give it up, move on, find a system that actually works.
Well, let's listen to what, or some of what, James Cleverly, the new Home Secretary, has been saying in response to the ruling.
We have been working with Rwanda to build capacity and amend agreements with Rwanda to make clear that those sent there cannot be sent to another country than the UK. Our intention is to uphold our agreement, to upgrade our agreement to a treaty as soon as possible. That will make it absolutely clear to our courts and to Strasbourg that the risks laid out by the court today have been responded to, will be consistent with international law and ensure that Parliament is able to scrutinise it. The Prime Minister has said that if our domestic legal framework frustrates our plans, he is prepared to change our laws. But I will inform the House we are not going to put forward proposals simply to manufacture an unnecessary row for political gain.
James Cleverly there, the Home Secretary, saying that they will pursue, as Maria was outlining, upgrading the agreement, the Memorandum of Understanding that the UK has with Rwanda to a full treaty. The question is whether that will see the light of day before the next election. I want to talk about something else with our guest, because later MPs will be voting on amendments on last week's King's speech when the legislative programme of the government was set out. The SNP motion is pressurising the government to call for a ceasefire. Tell us exactly what you're calling for.
Exactly that is an immediate ceasefire, and that has been our position from almost the outset since the atrocity of October the 7th. You know, now we have 13,000 dead, 4,500 children dead, and as difficult as it may be, I think it is absolutely incumbent on us to try and achieve this ceasefire. We have to find that political space in which we can find a political solution, because this has to be a political solution. It can't be anything else. Right. And only a ceasefire can deliver that.
Labour has stopped short of calling for a ceasefire with its amendment, and yet a third of your party, broadly speaking, does want to see the Labour Party and Keir Starmer call for a ceasefire. Why is Brendan O'Hara and your colleagues wrong?
I understand the strength of feeling that people have on this. We, all of us, every day see on our television screens awful suffering. So we also saw the events of the 7th of October, which were unparalleled in the brutality that we saw. We desperately want to see more humanitarian aid getting into Gaza through those humanitarian pauses. We want to see the urgent release of hostages.
So why not call for a ceasefire? A ceasefire would just stop the violence.
I think the answer that Brendan gave, I think, was quite revealing, in that he said that almost from the outset, he believes that a ceasefire should have taken place. I think Israel has a right and a responsibility to defend its borders and to seek the release of hostages. Now, that does not involve a blank check. That does not involve a blank check. Of course it doesn't. And, you know, it's impossible not to be horrified by the scenes that we see where you have children and families and innocent civilians affected. And where I do agree the way through this is a political settlement where we do get to a viable Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel.
All right, but that's some time off, and politicians here won't have that much influence on that. But anyway, go on.
The moment the international humanitarian law was breached, that's when we called for a ceasefire.
When was that?
Oh, it was almost immediately after the bombardment started. As soon as it became apparent that there was a blanket bombing of civilian population.
So you don't believe Israel has the right to defend itself in the way that they have set out, which is by rooting out Hamas, a terrorist organisation, as designated by the government. How else could it do it?
Well, it's not for me as a military strategist, but what I will say as a humanitarian is that if there is a civilian shield, then if Hamas are embedded within a civilian population...
Which the Israelis say they are.
The bombing of a civilian population that leaves at least 13,000 people dead is an egregious breach of international humanitarian law.
So what do you say?
The turning off of water, of electricity, of food and medicine supplies is a breach of international humanitarian law.
So what do you say when the Hamas spokesman has committed the organisation to repeat the massacres of October the 7th, in their own words, again and again until Israel is annihilated? Doesn't that completely and utterly undermine the idea of a ceasefire that they would not themselves adhere to?
It is absolutely incumbent on us to try everything. Now, if Hamas say that, then Hamas are utterly to be condemned for saying it.
But you're asking the Israelis to accept that they should leave themselves vulnerable in this instance.
What I am doing is we are standing with the United Nations General Secretary, President Macron, the Pope, great swathes of international humanitarian organisations, because there has to be a point at which a political solution is workable, and that is what this is about.
And isn't it about the government moving on this? We heard Andrew Mitchell yesterday, deputising for Lord Cameron, now Foreign Secretary. He came really close to urging the government to call for a ceasefire.
Well, there's a lot of work going on, and James Cleverly, when he was Foreign Secretary, did a huge amount of work in this, in trying to get those humanitarian pauses extended. There's about 4 hours a day at the moment where Israel
But that's
is allowing...
not cutting it. We've heard that. It's not enough time.
The thing about a ceasefire, and I think, Joe, you touched on this, is that has to be on both sides. And Hamas have been pretty clear since October the 7th that that is not going to be something that they're interested in. They would repeat those events of October the 7th.
Although, arguably, they have been rooted out, or certainly the infrastructure has been completely dismantled.
Well, there's, we don't know what's happening in those tunnels underneath. And that's, we know that when fuel has been delivered to Gaza, it has been taken by Hamas.
All right.
They haven't allowed that to go to hospitals.
Just very, very briefly, how big a rebellion on the Labour side? Resignations?
Yeah, definitely could be. If the SNP amendment is selected, we don't know that yet.
Well, of course, we don't know, but we're perhaps looking at maybe 5 or 6 resignations. But that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much to all of my guests for joining me, and I'll be back tomorrow for more. Bye.